Hidden behind layers of razor wire and cold Pacific fog lies Pelican Bay State Prison, a place many call the end of the line. For decades, it has symbolized the most extreme form of incarceration in the United States. But how does Pelican Bay compare to other notorious Supermax prisons? Today, we'll go inside the cells, policies, and human stories that reveal which facility truly holds the harshest conditions in America. Pelican Bay State Prison opened in 1989 in Crescent City, California, designed explicitly to house the state's most disruptive and dangerous prisoners. Built on 275 acres of isolated land near the Oregon border, the facility introduced a new era of control unit housing known as the Security Housing Unit, or SHU. This wasn't simply a segregation wing, it was an entire prison within a prison. From the start, the SHU held nearly 1,000 men in windowless concrete cells measuring about 8 by 10 feet. Each cell contained only a steel bunk, a sink, and a toilet. Inmates ate all meals through a slot in the door. There was no direct view of the outside world, only a narrow skylight called a light tube, allowing dim daylight to filter in. California officials argued this design was necessary to isolate gang leaders and end prison violence. In reality, placement often came not for overt acts, but for validation, a process in which confidential informants, tattoos, or possession of certain reading materials could label someone a gang affiliate. Once validated, a prisoner could be held indefinitely in the SHU without a fixed release date. By the mid-1990s, Pelican Bay's SHU had become the largest long-term solitary confinement unit in the country. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights all issued reports describing psychological deterioration, sensory deprivation, and suicides. Some prisoners reported hallucinations, and severe depression after years in isolation. One federal judge in the landmark case Madrid versus Gomez, 1995, concluded that conditions for mentally ill inmates at Pelican Bay violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. The SHU's exercise yard was a small, windowless concrete pen, often called a dog run. Inmates spent an hour a day alone there, with only a sliver of sky visible. Many prisoners described feeling like they were buried alive. Others likened the SHU to a clean version of hell: immaculate concrete, fluorescent lights, and endless silence broken only by the echo of steel doors slamming shut. Despite these criticisms, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation held up Pelican Bay as a model for controlling gang violence. Officials cited declines in prison homicides and assaults, arguing that isolating suspected gang leaders kept the rest of the population safer. Yet the cost was staggering. Thousands of men kept in near-total isolation for years, sometimes decades, with no meaningful review of their placement unless they agreed to debrief, to inform on other prisoners, risking their own safety and families on the outside. This policy of indefinite solitary confinement would later become the focal point of lawsuits, hunger strikes, and national debate over what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment. Pelican Bay's reputation as the harshest Supermax facility in the United States was cemented not only by its design, but by the absence of clear exit criteria for those confined inside. Pelican Bay's SHU did not emerge in a vacuum. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, a new generation of super-maximum security facilities was rising across the United States. These prisons were purpose-built to confine prisoners in extended isolation, a strategy sometimes called control unit or administrative segregation, housing. Yet while the design philosophy was similar, conditions and policies varied widely from state to state. One of the most famous comparisons is the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, better known as ADX Florence, in Colorado. Opened in 1994 after deadly incidents at USP Marion, ADX Florence was designed as the federal government's highest security prison. Housing about 400 men, including high-profile terrorists, spies, and cartel leaders, ADX Florence has been called the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Like Pelican Bay's SHU, most inmates spend 23 hours a day in single cells. The cells are roughly 7 by 12 feet, with solid doors and small windows angled so that only the sky is visible. Meals are eaten alone, and recreation occurs in narrow, high-walled pens that resemble empty swimming pools. But there are key differences. ADX. Florence is run by the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which operates under national policy statements and provides at least nominal review of an inmate's status every 12 months. Some prisoners are transferred to slightly less restrictive step-down units if they meet behavioral criteria, eventually working their way to less isolated conditions. In contrast, until 2015, Pelican Bay allowed inmates to remain in the SHU for decades based on gang validation alone, without a meaningful path out unless they debriefed. Other states experimented with Supermax models that were harsh but offered more programming. Ohio's Supermax at Youngstown, officially called the Ohio State Penitentiary, opened in 1998 after the 1993 Lucasville uprising. Initially, conditions mirrored Pelican Bay, long-term isolation with little review. Yet after a 2005 consent decree, Austin v. Wilkinson, Ohio implemented due process hearings and time limits on how long someone could stay in Supermax conditions. By 2011, the number of prisoners in the most restrictive cells had dropped dramatically. Mississippi provides another striking contrast. Its notorious Unit 32 at Mississippi State Penitentiary once held hundreds of men in conditions similar to Pelican Bay's SHU. Following litigation and Department of Justice investigations, the state began closing Unit 32 in the late 2000s and moving prisoners to less restrictive settings. A Vera Institute evaluation later found no long-term increase in assaults on staff or prisoners after the shift, suggesting that reducing isolation did not compromise safety. Even within California, newer facilities like the California Healthcare Facility in Stockton and retooled segregation units at other prisons began experimenting with step-down programs and mental health treatment options. While critics argue these reforms are limited, they illustrate that Pelican Bay's model was at the farthest end of the spectrum, highly restrictive, indefinite, and built around intelligence gathering from suspected gang affiliates rather than fixed disciplinary terms. These differences matter because they shape not only the daily lives of prisoners but also the legal and public perception of what Supermax means. Some facilities hold inmates in solitary as a short-term disciplinary measure or during investigations. Others, like Pelican Bay pre-2015, imposed isolation as a de facto life sentence without trial or conviction for a new offense. As a result, lawyers, journalists, and human rights groups often use Pelican Bay as the benchmark when arguing about the human cost of prolonged solitary confinement. If Chapter 1 showed how Pelican Bay's SHU was built, and Chapter 2 compared it to other Supermaxes, this chapter enters the cells themselves to show what life is like, and how that life sparked lawsuits that changed U.S. corrections. Inside Pelican Bay's SHU, prisoners were locked in their cells for 22.5 to 24 hours per day. Meals slid through a metal slot. Conversation was limited to muffled shouts between vents. Visits were non-contact through thick glass. Mail was censored. Many prisoners described losing their sense of time. Some paced in circles just to feel movement. Mental health experts documented high rates of depression, panic attacks, paranoia, and self-harm. In a 2012 article for the New York Times, psychiatrist Dr. Terry Coopers called the SHU a mental health disaster zone. Placement often stemmed from gang validation rather than a violent act. Inmates could be labeled gang members if they had certain tattoos, possessed artwork or writings deemed gang-related, or were named by confidential informants. Once validated, they were sent to the SHU indefinitely. The only formal route out was debriefing, in which an inmate provided intelligence on others, a process critics said was dangerous and incentivized false information. This regime drew scrutiny in the early 1990s. In Madrid v. Gomez, N.D. Calden 1995, U.S. District Judge Thelton Henderson held that conditions for mentally ill inmates in the SHU violated the Eighth Amendment. Although the court stopped short of declaring the SHU itself unconstitutional for all prisoners, it ordered California to remove seriously mentally ill inmates from Pelican Bay's SHU and improve medical care. Despite the ruling, indefinite isolation continued. By 2011, more than 500 Pelican Bay prisoners had been in solitary for over a decade. 78 had been there for over 20 years. That year, inmates launched one of the largest hunger strikes in California history to protest indefinite SHU confinement. More than 6,000 prisoners across the state participated in solidarity. The strikes of 2011 and 2013 brought national attention to Pelican Bay's policies. Leg. L advocates built on this momentum. In 2012, the Center for Constitutional Rights filed Ashker v. Brown on behalf of long-term SHU prisoners, challenging indefinite solitary and the gang validation system as violations of the 8th and 14th Amendments. In 2015, California settled the case, agreeing to end indefinite SHU terms and to limit the use of gang validation alone to place someone in solitary. The settlement created a new step-down program, offering increased privileges and pathways back to general population. Thousands of prisoners were transferred out of the SHU within months. This legal arc illustrates a key difference between Pelican Bay and other Supermaxes. ADX Florence, for instance, is brutal but offers clearer policies. Inmates are reviewed annually, and there are designated step-down units. Ohio's reforms impose time limits. Mississippi dismantled Unit 32. Pelican Bay, until forced by litigation, operated on an open-ended basis, making it the emblem of what critics call indefinite solitary confinement. Beyond the courtroom, the human toll remained evident. Former SHU prisoners reported persistent insomnia, anxiety, and difficulty socializing after release. Some compared the transition to stepping off a spaceship after years in orbit. A 2007 study by University of Washington researchers, Lovell et al., found that prisoners released directly from solitary to the community had significantly higher rates of recidivism and violent reoffending than those transitioned through general population. This research fueled legislative debates in Colorado, New Jersey, and North Dakota, which later passed laws restricting solitary confinement duration. Thus, Pelican Bay's story is not only about walls and policies, but also about the long shadow it casts over prisoners' lives, and how lawsuits and hunger strikes forced the state to reckon with that shadow.
On a sunny afternoon, the
2015 Ashker v. Brown settlement marked a historic turning point. California agreed to dramatically scale back the use of indefinite solitary confinement at Pelican Bay and other prisons. Under the agreement, prisoners could no longer be placed in the SHU solely on gang validation. Instead, they had to be found guilty of a serious rules violation. Those already in long-term isolation were transferred to general population or into a new step-down program with gradually increasing privileges: phone calls, contact visits, small group recreation, and limited programming. By 2016, the number of prisoners in Pelican Bay's SHU had fallen from about 1,100 to fewer than 100. National headlines declared the end of indefinite solitary in California. Human rights groups hailed it as a model for other states, yet critics warned that the reforms, while significant, did not eliminate extreme isolation. California still operates administrative segregation units where prisoners may spend months awaiting investigation. The step-down program itself retains restrictive conditions that some prisoners and lawyers argue resemble solitary by another name. Meanwhile, the federal Supermax ADX Florence and other state facilities continue to confine hundreds of men in near-total isolation. Although some states, Colorado, New Jersey, North Dakota, have imposed statutory limits on solitary confinement, there is no national standard. According to data compiled by the Association of State Correctional Administrators and Yale Law School's Lyman Center, tens of thousands of people remain in restrictive housing nationwide on any given day. The debate over Supermax prisons also intersects with broader issues: racial disparities in gang validation, the treatment of mentally ill prisoners, and the question of whether extreme isolation deters violence or simply deepens trauma. Studies from Mississippi and Maine suggest that reducing solitary does not lead to more assaults on staff or prisoners. Yet correctional leaders often view Supermax housing as an essential management tool for the most violent or disruptive inmates. Pelican Bay today still houses some of California's highest security prisoners. Its SHU is no longer the massive, indefinite isolation unit it once was, but its legacy endures in lawsuits, policy debates, and the memories of those who lived inside. For prisoners who spent decades in solitary, the psychological scars are permanent. For advocates, Pelican Bay remains a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly an extraordinary security measure can become a routine form of punishment. Comparing Pelican Bay with other supermaxes shows both progress and persistence. On one end are states experimenting with step-down programs, mental health treatment, and limits on isolation. On the other are facilities like ADX Florence, still operating at the outer edge of restriction. Pelican Bay's journey from unreviewable indefinite solitary to a reformed model encapsulates the national struggle over what level of deprivation is acceptable behind bars. From the Pacific coast of Crescent City to the high plains of Colorado, the United States built prisons meant to control its most feared inmates. Pelican Bay became the symbol of that experiment. Its SHU a byword for indefinite solitary. Lawsuits, hunger strikes, and public pressure forced change, but the core question remains: how far should a democracy go in isolating those it incarcerates? As viewers, journalists, and citizens, understanding these hidden places matters. They reveal not only how we punish, but who we are. Pelican Bay versus other Supermax prisons is more than a comparison of walls and policies. It's a mirror held up to the nation's values.